June 6th, 1523, the Cathedral of Strängnäs, a small town on the shore of Lake Mälaren, west of Stockholm. A man stands before the altar. He is in his late 20s, tall, with a full beard and intense eyes. His name is Gustav Vasa, and in a few minutes, he will be elected King of Sweden. The Archbishop of Sweden places the crown on his head. The gathered nobles and clergy kneel. The choir sings, and just like that, the Kalmar Union is dead. It had been limping along for over a century through peasant revolts and noble feuds, through Engelbrekt's acts and Erik's downfall, through compromise after compromise that never quite held. But today, in this cathedral, Sweden is walking away for good. Gustav Vasa will become the father of modern Sweden, and the union Margareta Valdemar's daughter built. The dream of united Scandinavia under one crown will be over. But the road from Engelbrekt's death to this cathedral was long and bloody and anything but straight. And that is the story we are telling today. Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. So this week in SFE, we moved on from Hemma to consumption, shopping, buying, what we spend our money on. We learned to talk about grocery stores and prices and whether we think things are cheap or expensive. And I am happy to report I did well on my test last week. Small victory, I'll take it. But all week, I've been thinking about consumption in a bigger sense, not just what we buy at the store, but what we consume and what consumes us. Power consumes, empires consume, and the man we are talking about today, Gustav Vasa, consumed a whole union and built a nation from its bones. Last episode, we left Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson dead on an island in Lake Mälaren. The peasant rebellion that had shaken the Kalmar Union was leaderless. King Erik was still on the throne, but not for long, and the crack Engelbrekt had opened was about to spread. Today, we are following that crack all the way to the rupture, from Engelbrekt's assassination in 1436 to Gustav Vasa's coronation in 1523. Nearly 90 years of Swedish history. We're going to meet two kings who tried to hold the union together and nobles who tore it apart. We're going to see a massacre that changed everything, and we're going to watch a young fugitive become the father of modern Sweden. We're still working toward that citizenship test episode. Nobody knows what's on it yet, but as soon as the details come, I'll build that study guide. For now, let's keep building the foundation. All right, the crack. Engelbrekt was dead, his peasant army scattered. The man who had been captain of the realm, the miner who stood up to a king, was buried in Örebro. And the question of who ordered his killing was already fading into the background noise of political maneuvering. But Engelbrekt's rebellion had done something irreversible. It had shown the Swedish people, peasants, miners, nobles alike, that the Kalmar Union was not an unchangeable fact of nature. It was a political arrangement, and political arrangements can be renegotiated or broken. King Erik of Pomerania, meanwhile, was in a freefall. His disastrous war with Holstein was still dragging on. The promises of reform he had made under pressure in 1435 were already broken. The nobility in three kingdoms had lost faith. Engelbrekt's rebellion had revealed Erik for what he was, a king who did not know how to rule, who saw his kingdoms as resources to be drained, who had learned nothing from the woman who raised him. Historians describe this period as a moment the Kalmar Union fundamentally changed. It was no longer a personal union held together by the force of one ruler. It became a loose arrangement, a series of negotiations and compromises between the councils of the realm in each kingdom. In theory, the union still existed. In practice, it was an argument that never stopped. In 1439, just 3 years after Engelbrekt's assassination, Erik was deposed in all three kingdoms. He fled to Gotland, the island where his adopted mother's father, Valdemar Atterdag, had slaughtered the Gutnish farmers 80 years earlier. He set up in Visby and became a pirate. a literal pirate, raiding Baltic shipping to fund his exile. The king, who had inherited Margaretta's union, ended his days as a robber baron on a rock in the Baltic. He died in 1459, outliving his relevance by decades. A cautionary tale in a crown. Eric's successor was his nephew, Christopher of Bavaria. He was crowned King of Denmark in 1440, of Sweden in 1441, and of Norway in 1442. And he did something Eric could never do. He compromised. Christopher accepted the Swedish Council of the Realm as a genuine partner in governance. He agreed to rule according to Swedish law. He appointed Swedes to Swedish castles. For a brief moment, it looked like the union might actually work as Margareta had intended. 3 equal kingdoms, united under one crown, but each governing itself. But Christopher died suddenly in 1448. He was only 32 years old, no children, no clear heir, and the union was thrown back into chaos. Now we need to talk about Carl Knut. I mentioned him briefly in the last episode. He was the nobleman who stepped into Engelbrekt's role as Riksholdsman after the assassination, and he would become one of the most complicated figures in Swedish history. Carl Knut was a nobleman from one of the great families. He had supported Engelbrekt's rebellion, cautiously, strategically, and making sure he was on the winning side. After Engelbrekt's death, he positioned himself as leader of the Swedish nationalist faction, the nobles who wanted maximum autonomy from Denmark. And in 1448, after Christopher's death, Carl Knut was elected King of Sweden. King Carl VIII, the first Swedish-born king to rule an independent Sweden in decades. But here's the thing about the Kalmar Union at this point. It was a revolving door. The Danish nobility elected their own king, Christian I of Oldenburg, the founder of a dynasty that still sits on the Danish throne today. And the union became a tug of war between the Danish crown, which wanted to keep all 3 kingdoms together, and the Swedish nobility, which wanted to go their own way. Carl Knut was King of Sweden 3 separate times. 3. He was elected in 1448, deposed in 1457, elected again in 1464, deposed again in 1465, elected a 3rd time in 1467, and finally died on the throne in 1470. Between his reigns, Christian I of Denmark ruled Sweden, or tried to. The Swedish nobles would get fed up, depose the Danish king, bring Carl back, and then get fed up with Carl, depose him, and bring the Danish king back. It was exhausting, it was chaotic, and it meant that Sweden was never fully part of the Union and never fully independent. Historian Dick Harrison calls this period the Union Shuffle, a decades-long dance of depositions and reinstatements that satisfied no one. The Union was technically intact, but it had become a fiction held together by exhaustion and inertia. Everyone knew something had to give. It would, but not before one of the darkest moments in Swedish history. We have to talk about 1520, the year the Kalmar Union died, not with a whimper, but with an axe. By the early 1500s, the Union was on life support. The Danish king was Christian II, a man with ambitions of restoring the full Kalmar Union under a strong, centralized crown. The Swedish nobility was divided. Some, the Unionist faction, wanted to remain under Danish leadership. Others, the nationalist faction, wanted full independence under a Swedish ruler. The leader of the nationalist faction was a young nobleman named Sten Sture the Younger, who held the title of Regent of Sweden. Not king, but the man running things. In 1520, Christian II invaded Sweden. He had an army of Danish, German, and mercenary soldiers. Sten Sture the Younger met him in battle at Bogesund, on the ice of Lake Osunden. Sten Sture was hit by a cannonball. His leg was shattered. He died of his wounds a few days later. His wife, Christina Gyllenhuerne, took over the defense of Stockholm. She held out for months, a woman commanding the city walls against a besieging army. Another remarkable woman in our story, though history has been less kind to her memory than Margaretta's. Eventually, Stockholm fell. Christian II promised amnesty. He promised to rule Sweden justly, to respect Swedish laws, to forgive everyone who had opposed him. He was crowned King of Sweden in November of 1520, and then 3 days after the coronation, he threw a party. The coronation banquet lasted 3 days. The Swedish nobles and bishops who had opposed Christian were invited. They ate, they drank, they danced. And on the third day, Christian closed the gates of the banquet hall and had them arrested. What followed is called the Stockholm Bloodbath. On November 7th and 8th, 1520, Christian II had somewhere between 80 and 100 people executed in the main square of Stockholm. Bishops, nobles, city councilors. Sten Story the Younger's body was dug up from its grave and burned. Christina Gyllenhuerna was imprisoned. The executioner worked for hours. The cobblestones ran red. Christian II probably thought he was solving his Sweden problem. Eliminate the opposition in one stroke. Decapitate the nationalist faction. Rule Sweden by fear. He was wrong. He had just created Gustav Vasa. Gustav Eriksson Vasa was not in that banquet hall. He was not on the list of the executed. He was, in fact, on the run. Gustav Vasa was the son of Erik Johansson Vasa, a Swedish nobleman who is among those executed in the Stockholm Bloodbath. Gustav himself had been a hostage of Christian II, held in Denmark as a guarantee of his family's loyalty. But he had escaped, disguised himself, fled across Denmark, across the Baltic, and made his way back to Sweden. When he arrived, he learned that his father was dead, murdered in the bloodbath, and the Danish king who had ordered it was now claiming to rule Sweden. Gustav Vasa was in his early 20s. He had no army, no money, no throne, just a dead father and a grudge. But he had something Christian II didn't. He could talk to the people. The historian Lars Olaf Larsson, whose biography of Engelbrekt I relied on heavily for the last episode, also writes about Gustav Vasa's early career. He describes Gustav as a man of extraordinary charisma and utter ruthlessness, a survivor who knew how to tell people what they wanted to hear. He was not an idealist like Engelbrekt. He was a pragmatist, and that made him dangerous. Gustav Vasa fled to Dalarna, a region north of Bergslagen, the same mining country that had produced Engelbrekt's rebellion 90 years earlier. He went to the peasants and the miners and told them what had happened in Stockholm: the bloodbath, the executions, the broken promises, the Danish king who had slaughtered their nobles and now demanded their submission. The peasants were skeptical. They had been burned before by noblemen who promised change and delivered more of the same. According to legend, and we have to be careful here because the story has been heavily mythologized, Gustav stood in the church square in Mora and pleaded with them. They said no. He left, heading for Norway, planning to flee the country entirely. And then, so the story goes, a messenger caught up with him on the road. The peasants had changed their minds. They had heard more about the bloodbath. They had decided to fight. 2 fast skiers caught up with Gustav near the Norwegian border, and Gustav Vasa turned around and came back. That moment, the messenger on skis, the desperate chase through the snow, the young nobleman who almost gave up, became the founding myth of modern Sweden. It's commemorated today at the Vasaloppet, the world's oldest and longest cross-country ski race, held every year between Salin and Mora, 90 kilometers. People do it for fun. I cannot explain this. Swedes are Swedes. Gustav Vasa returned to Mora, raised an army, and started the war that would end the Kalmar Union forever. The war that followed is called the Swedish War of Liberation, Befrielsekriget, and it was brutal. Gustav Vasa's army was mostly peasants and miners, just like Engelbrekt's had been. But Gustav had something Engelbrekt didn't: a clear goal. He wasn't fighting to reform the Union, he was fighting to end it. Sweden would be independent, with its own king, its own laws, its own destiny, and he would be that king. The war took 2.5 years, castle by castle, town by town, Gustav's forces pushed the Danish loyalists out. Christian II, meanwhile, was dealing with his own problems back in Denmark. His brutality in the Stockholm Bloodbath had horrified even his supporters. He was deposed in Denmark in 1523, replaced by his uncle Frederick I, and without a Danish king to back them, the remaining Danish forces in Sweden crumbled. In June 1523, Gustav Vasa entered Stockholm, and on June 6, he was elected King of Sweden by the assembled nobles and clergy. The Kalmar Union was over. After 126 years after Margaretha's vision and Eric's incompetence, and Engelbrekt's rebellion in the Stockholm Bloodbath, and a young fugitive's desperate fight through the snow, Sweden was independent. It has been independent ever since. Let me pause here because this is one of those things that ties the history directly to modern Sweden. June 6th is Sweden's National Day, and it is a 2-for-1. The first reason is June 6, 1523, the day Gustav Vasa is elected king. That's the birth of Sweden as an independent, sovereign state. The Kalmar Union ends, Sweden stands alone. The second reason is June 6, 1809. On that day, a new constitution is signed. The 1809 Instrument of Government, or regeringsformen, it replaced the absolutist monarchy with a constitutional one, establishing civil liberties and separation of powers. It lasted until 1974. So the day carries both the birth of Swedish state and the birth of modern Swedish democracy. It became the official national day in 1983 and a public holiday in 2005. And if you've ever been to Sweden on June 6, you know it's pretty low key. Swedes don't do chest thumping patriotism. It's more like a day off, some ice cream, maybe the royal family and folk costumes on TV. Princess cake and quiet picnics. The country Gustav Vasa founded celebrates his birthday by being aggressively relaxed about it. I kind of love that. So, what kind of man was Gustav Vasa? He's a national hero, the father of the nation, the guy on the pedestal. And like a lot of guys on pedestals, the view from up close is more complicated. Gustav Vasa was a builder. He created the modern Swedish state. Before Gustav, Sweden was a collection of provinces held together by custom and treaty. After Gustav, Sweden had a centralized administration, standing army, a reformed church, and a hereditary monarchy. He broke the power of the Catholic Church in Sweden and seized its lands, which gave the crown resources it needed to govern. He created the basis for the Swedish bureaucracy that still exists today, the same bureaucracy that issued my personal number, the same system that organizes the SFE classes where I'm learning how to say how much milk costs. In a very real sense, the Sweden I live in now traces its lineage back to Gustav Vasa's state building. But Gustav Vasa was also a tyrant. He crushed dissent ruthlessly. When the peasants of Småland and Dalarna rebelled against his taxes and his centralization, the same peasants who had put him on the throne, he had their leaders executed. He maintained control through a network of spies and informers. He treated the kingdom as his personal property. The historian Peter England describes him as a Renaissance prince in the worst sense of the word, a man who believed he answered to no one, who used violence as a tool of policy, who saw his subjects as resources to be managed. Sound familiar? It should. In some ways, Gustav Vasa was the king Engelbrekt had rebelled against, just wearing a Swedish crown. The peasant who fought for a voice in government was replaced by a king who believed the government was his voice alone. People are complicated, heroes doubly so. The Kalmar Union was dead, but the idea of Nordic unity never really died with it. Denmark and Norway remained united until 1814, when Norway was transferred to Sweden after the Napoleonic Wars. Sweden and Norway shared a king until 1905. And even today, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland, are bound together by the Nordic Council, by passport-free travel, by cultural ties that long predate modern politics. I mentioned the Aurora Center think tank in Margaretha's episode. They advocate for a new Nordic confederation, a soft superpower that could stand together in an unstable world. The dream Margareta had in 1397, the dream Engelbrekt cracked open, the dream Gustav Vasa ended in 1523, it still flickers quietly in the background, the idea that these Nordic lands might stand together. But Sweden chose its own path, and that path, for better or worse, runs through Gustav Vasa. So, consumption. That's the SFE theme for the next 5 weeks. Consumption. That's what we buy, what we spend, what we use. Gustav Vasa consumed the Kalmar Union. He consumed the Catholic Church's lands. He consumed the patience of the peasants who had put him in power. He built a nation from everything he consumed. That nation is one I'm living in now, the one I'm trying to understand one episode at a time. I did well on my test last week, small steps. I can talk about where I live and what I buy and a little bit about what I do in my free time. This podcast is my free time, and honestly, that feels right. Understanding this place, its history, its myths, its heroes, and its bloodbaths. That's not homework. It's how I'm making Sweden my home. Jag ska hända med på matafaren och sen ska jag promenera I skogen. Efter det ska jag plugga, ha en bra vecka. Next episode, we'll keep moving forward. The Reformation comes to Sweden, Gustav Vasa tightens his grip, and the country starts to look more and more like the Sweden we recognize today. If you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with someone who's also trying to find the real Sweden beyond the postcard. Tack så mycket for listening. Hej då for now.